Hello, I'm Rebecca Binder. I'm going to give people just a few seconds to get on, to get logged on.
Look at them. I see the numbers going.
There you go.
It's like everyone's going into their seats.
Yeah. Great. I'll get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Binder, an HBS alum and member of the programming team for the Harvard Business School Club of New York. We have a fantastic program tonight featuring Marco Greenberg, who has worked closely with some of the world's most driven founders and CEOs, advising them on issues that affect their bottom line. Marco Greenberg will speak to us about the common thread that he found that connects all these leaders: primitiveness. Our club is the largest HBS alumni organization in the world, serving 10,000 graduates in the New York area. Our mission is to make a difference by engaging alumni, impacting the community, and fostering leadership and lifelong learning. One of the ways we have done this is by organizing 100 live events per year. But now we're creating a new way by building a robust calendar of high quality webinars such as this one. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any great ideas. Before getting started, a few housekeeping items. Our moderator will lead the discussion for the first 40 minutes. At that point, we'll open it up for questions from the audience for the last 20 minutes. You may submit questions by typing them into the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, and you may include your company name or industry if you'd like. We'll do our best to get through all of them. So with that, I'm honored to welcome our featured guest this evening, Marco Greenberg. Marco Greenberg has spearheaded marketing, communications, and public affairs campaigns for an array of Fortune 500 corporations, healthcare organizations, and notable ventures, and angel-backed startups, and has served as a senior advisor to foreign governments, democratic movements, and NGOs. Previously a managing director at a global PR giant, Burson Marsteller, he sees his role as a creative catalyst for breakthrough communications. He holds a BA from UCLA and an MA from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and has taught as an adjunct professor of innovations in marketing at NYU and entrepreneurship and PR at Fordham University. Our moderator this evening is Jacqueline Adams. Jacqueline Adams is an HBS alum and a member of the HBS Club of New York board. She launched her second career as a communications strategist after more than 2 decades as an Emmy Award-winning CBS News correspondent. She actually shared with me on a call earlier today that during her first year at HBS, she was also a news broadcaster on the weekends. So it made for a very busy first year of her MBA.
Well, actually, both years.
Oh, both years, excuse me, both years. Jacqueline Adams covered the groundbreaking campaigns, including Jesse Jackson for president, before spending 5 years as a White House correspondent during the Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. Ms. Adams leveraged her incredible background of both business and journalism to start over 18 years ago her boutique firm, J. Adams Strategic Communications. In this capacity, she has served a variety of corporate and nonprofit clients. In addition to being on the board of HBS New York, she's very involved with a number of organizations in the sectors that she reported on, from foreign policy to the arts to education reform and diversity issues. She recently wrote a book entitled A Blessing: Women of Color Teaming Up to Lead, Empower, and Thrive. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations as well as the U.S. Institute of Peace International Advisory Committee. I will now pass it on to Jacqueline to lead the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been lovely getting to know you because you're new to me on the this next hour with my good buddy Marco Greenberg. Just a warning, I'm in a pre-war building and my Wi-Fi is not 100%, so if I freeze up or disappear, we'll wait a second and then it should come back quickly. In the interest of full disclosure, Marco and I have been friends and colleagues for more than a decade, and he has the distinction of having been my final in-person meeting, a lunch on March 12th. I've been in lockup since then. So Marco, you will always have a very special place in my heart because of that lunch. And during that lunch, he described to me his new book, Primitive. And what's interesting is that even though our perspectives are slightly different, obviously a little bit different, a lot of the themes in Primitive are echoed in my book, A Blessing, which will come out in October. Marco is the co-founder of a very successful communication shop called Thunder 11, and I have witnessed firsthand his creativity, his bound energy, but perhaps most important, his heart. I knew that Marco was a square peg in Burson Marsteller's place of round, and he's taken that observation and transformed it into, and I see I'm breaking up. Marco has done a fascinating study of success and power and influence called Primitive. So Marco, let's get started. What's it been like publishing a book in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, you know, Jackie, there's a line that man plans and God laughs. And this was not what we expected. I must say, though, that in many ways, it fits into the theme of the book. And obviously, I did not have a crystal ball, but we are facing a very primal time, right? We're looking at our mortality. We're thinking about sustenance and shelter and safety. And for many, unfortunately, how do we put food on the table? So I think the theme of the book is certainly apropos for the time. And primitive, I just want to acknowledge to everyone out there, it is a loaded term. It is provocative. I do not mean it in the sense of being crude or coarse, and certainly not cruel. We mean it in the most positive, pure, natural, organic sense. So what comes to us intuitively, instinctively, innately. And I think we all know that listening to our bodies, listening to our heart and soul is not just important in our personal lives, but also important in our business lives. And the impetus for the book really happened when I was sitting on the couch of my Upper West Side office, and I was trying to think, what connects these successful people that I've had great fortune in aggregating and working really closely with as a confidant. And I was thinking of, you know, the Fortune 500 CEOs and the heads of startups who founded a company with nothing and sold it at unicorn status, to mad scientists, crazy artists. And my first inclination when I was thinking of these people, and obviously in my background, in my head, I'm also thinking about people I haven't worked with, right? Most of them I haven't, whether it's Elon Musk, whether it's Oprah, whether it's Mark Benioff. Had an opportunity to work a little bit with Ariana, and she's certainly in Primitive. But I came to the conclusion that these are people who march to their own drum. These are people who we call the non-conventionals, the non-traditionals. We have all these labels, you know, they're mavericks, they're rebels, they're change agents, they're disruptors. But I think it's missing a big point, which is really primal, right? It goes back tens of thousands of years. And there is a part of the brain, I'm not a neuroscientist, I want to make that absolutely clear, but I do work with a few. And there's a primitive part of our brain that was often discounted for the more cerebral part. And what we're trying to get across in this book is that it's really time that we reclaim the primitive nature that we have in the most positive sense and really use it to leapfrog ahead in our professional lives.
You have a very meaningful acronym in the book. You say that successful people can be even more successful if they go roaming, ROAMING. Do you want me to let people know what the letters indicate, or do you want to go?
I'll go through it, and I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory to that. You know, I was thinking about a word that could connect the ancient with the modern, and we certainly have that in roaming, right? We're looking at our phone, roaming charges when we go abroad, et cetera, et cetera. And the first letter in the acronym that occurred to me when I was thinking of some of the most successful people out there who were free spirits, mavericks, et cetera, was they're friggin' nuts.
That's the N.
That's the N. We have the N. We have one letter. I feel like we're playing, you know, Pat Sajak here. For those, I'm dating myself.
It's still
the N is nuts, and we mean that in again, the good kind of crazy. we don't want to disparage those that are dealing with mental illness. I definitely make that very, very clear in the book. But those who are eccentric, those who are a bit out there, those who don't do what they're supposed to do, but what they think intuitively is the right thing to do within respecting the law, within being ethically, et cetera. So I'll step back. The R is relentless. And I'll just go very quickly, but I want to point out some misnomers around some of these terms that we throw out. For me, relentless is not just working hard. Sometimes it's knowing when to make a sharp right turn or a sharp left turn, or make a U-turn and go back to where you started from, or to stop the car entirely. Now, we talk about examples of that, of knowing when to quit, that can actually be part of being relentless rather than just plowing ahead and sometimes, unfortunately, going into a brick wall. O is oppositional. Jackie, we know the dynamic, and a lot of our viewers know the dynamic of being on a conference call or in a board meeting. Too often there's groupthink. There's yes men, yes women, echoing, agreeing. And what I try to say in my book is actually having healthy dissent, respectful opposition is more in line with the overall welfare of the organization and our overall welfare as human beings.
That's one of the arguments for diversity. Diversity
Exactly.
in C-suite, diversity on boards.
We need people from different races, different nationalities, different ethnic groups, genders, the whole gamut. And that's another thing that I want to make clear. This book is for everyone, right? So we talked about O. A is for agnostic, not wedded to any one device, but not wedded perhaps to any one silo, to any one specific career. And we talk about people that eat at the buffet of their professional life. Some people call them Renaissance people. I think agnostic captures it a little differently, and I'll explain why more into the conversation. M is for messianic. That's right, messianic. Seeing ourselves on a divine calling in terms of our profession. It's not just passion, but it's really, we have an overriding purpose to sometimes solve the unsolvable. Talk about a client.
I think of it as drive. I think of it as drive.
Drive to a different level. And I always thought of that word as off-putting. I had a mentor who worked for Edgar Bronfman Sr., and it was my first job at Columbia University, and I was working for the World Jewish Congress that Edgar was the president of. And his right-hand man, Steve Herbert, said to me, if you really want to be successful in your life, you have to be messianic. And when he said that, it felt grandiose. It felt off-putting. I had visions of the Jerusalem syndrome. It had too much, but it's taken me a few decades to realize he was absolutely right. I stands for insecure. For some, counterintuitive, right? We're not talking about the value of bravado and overconfidence. We're talking about the fact that you can actually weaponize those insecurities, embrace them, acknowledge them. We profile a former colleague who runs YouTube in EMEA on the marketing front, and she says, I'm the most insecure person I know. It makes me a better manager. It makes me more empathetic. It makes me more sympathetic, et cetera, and sensitive. And we talked about, and finally, G is gallant. And for me, this is a favorite bucket. It means that we really need to care about the other. It's not just ourselves. We have a word in Hebrew, achrayut, my one word in Hebrew that I'm going to say tonight. It's actually a Jewish holiday. My religious friends are probably mad at me for being on. Shavuot is the holiday, 7 weeks after Passover. And it really comes from responsibility for the other. Acher is the other. And there are great examples of that. One is Kirk McDonald, who we both know, Jackie, who's now one of the most important people at AT&T, African-American, expert in anything advertising and marketing and technology. And I know that's a big swath, but we talk about how he leads by really putting others in front of himself. So that's the acronym roaming. And the idea is that even if you don't identify as an uber primitive and say, well, I'm not Ariana and I'm certainly not Steve Jobs, the idea is how do we tap into this to give us a little fuel injection, especially during a time when we're facing economic headwinds, the likes of which we probably haven't seen since 1929?
There's an opposite concept, opposite to primitive, you describe as civilized. And the acronym is HOMING, HOMING. Can you describe what homing is? And
Absolutely. So I'm not audacious enough to think I'm the next Carl Jung inventing archetypes that are going to be with us forever, like introvert and extrovert, or even right brain, left brain, morning person, night person. Am I an entrepreneur? Am I more corporate? But what we tried to do in homing is just spell out what characterizes more civilized people, people who are more invested in process, a certain methodology, crossing the T's, dotting their I's. And I want to make absolutely clear, we're all on a spectrum, right? I see myself as more of a mutt. I'm a little bit in between. I skew more primitive, but I definitely have civilized traits. And those traits are as follows: hierarchy, hierarchical. So people feel comfortable in a hierarchy. They might be at the top. They might aspire to move from the bottom to the top, but that's their comfort zone, right? O is occupational. I am a captain in the Army. I am an IRS auditor. I am a transactional attorney. That is their identity. They're not agnostic. They don't jump from field to field. They stay in their lane. M is measured, which is important in a lot of organizations. Sometimes primitives can be a little bit out there, and there are some cautionary tales, as you know, Jackie, that we share in the book. I is for insulated, doesn't mean that they're not sophisticated, that they're not successful, that they're not smart, but they work within their orbit. N is non-confrontational. Sometimes that can be passive aggressive, and we all know that kind of trait, but it's not that oppositional, being willing to really disagree in a vigorous way, but in a constructive way. And G is grounded.
I think I may have been more of a homing person in the first part of my career. And God bless menopause, because if you're no longer a girl, you don't have to be a good one. And I've become really rather primitive, I think, in this stage of life. In your Relentless chapter, you defend the use of white lies and of staging temper tantrums. When I read those passages, I have to tell you, I thought they reflected a lot of your white privilege, because a Black woman has to face the issue of angry Black woman over and over again. And I couldn't envision having a temper tantrum and staying employed.
Yeah, I think you make a very, very powerful point. And I'd be first to say that there is, unfortunately, tragically, still a double standard. And you and I have several friends in common, and one of our dear friends happens to be one of the most talented tech execs, entrepreneurs, HuffPo, and is also African American. And he read the book and he said, you know what? I feel the onus on me to be more civilized is so much more than people who are white that don't have to contend with some of these challenges. And as he was reading it, he was saying, look, I want to give myself permission to tap into more of that primitive energy and to be able to say, I disagree, and back it up forcefully, rather than be the good little boy, the good little girl that everyone is taught to be, right? We're inculcated in, it's almost like, remember Supertramp, the logical song? To think rationally, logically. It was a rock group from the 70s. Maybe someone can chime in on that just to verify my music trivia. But it's really true, and it's unfortunate that still today, people of color and women, and both, have to surmount an obstacle that people that look like me do not have to surmount. I am the father of 2 daughters. And I think it's important for them, especially, to allow themselves, to empower themselves, to not always have to be forced to stand in line and wait in line and get the accolades, but often to cut the line And you mentioned white lies. You know, I got to say, I got a job, and maybe people remember this, that there was a place called the Vertical Club in New York City. And it was the hottest gym in town. And I had just gotten into Columbia University, and I needed a part-time job. And I networked, a friend of my dad's got me a job. And they looked at me and they said, "You've been a trainer before, right? You've worked as a trainer." I instinctively said, yes, because I had worked out a lot. I had worked people out, but technically I was never paid to be a trainer. I couldn't sleep the night before. I don't even think my kids know this story. I was tossing and turning, but you know what? I gave myself permission, not in a malicious way, I don't think in an unethical way, but to say that I can help these people here. It was a job that I had for 3.5 years, part-time, and I landed 2 full-time jobs because of it. There's another example in our book of white lies, told by a white guy, Austin McCord, who, when he was starting a company that eventually became a unicorn, and he sold to Robert F. Smith of Vista Equity Partners for north of $1.5 billion, his company at one stage was so small, it was just him and a bunch of Lego blocks that he was turning into servers to sell to dentist's office for backup storage. And he would occasionally answer the phone with a British accent, pretending to be a non-existent colleague to make his company seem bigger. So obviously,
there's also the Rent the Runway example that you cited.
And by the way, that's a great example. It's an HBS example. And even though there are some that might say that HBS is more civilized, Jennifer Hyman of Rent the Runway, I've never had an opportunity to meet her, but via Guy Raz of one of my favorite podcasts that talks about tech startups, and he is just, you know, amazing. And she talks about a meeting that her young company was really counting on with Diane von Furstenberg. And they were driving down the West Side Highway to the meeting with her partner, also named Jennifer. And they get a call from von Furstenberg's assistant saying the meeting is off. And Jennifer's instinctive reaction was, I think we're having cell trouble. I can't hear you. We'll see you in Midtown. A lot of people would have just taken the rejection at face value and turned the other direction. She kept plowing ahead. So those are a couple anecdotes of the value of some primitive moves in terms of taking our careers to the next level.
I guess if I thought about the concept of roaming instead of relentless, I might have said ruthless, because I sort of embrace that ruthless notion myself.
Yeah. I think there are versions of primitives who are kind of like the difference between crude oil and refined oil. My preference, and the people that we try to model in the book, are the latter, not the former. So people that are more evolved, that are more refined, that can take that great primitive primal energy, that mindset, and realize that in today's world especially, and we've talked about this, that mindset trumps credentials. Even though the people on this call probably have some of the best credentials in the world, you're one of them, Jackie, but in this kind of world where the civilized rule book has been thrown out the door and iconic brands are no more, whether it is Hertz Rent-A-Car or J. Crew, it's time that, you know, we borrow what's become a cliche from Steve Jobs and think different. And part of thinking different is actually retro and going back tens of thousands of years in a refined, evolved way.
Another concept that you address, and we also address it in our book, A Blessing, is the whole notion of failure. And I argue that too many people are embracing failure this way. They see it as a critical component to innovation. But what is your take on failure, and how do you differentiate making a mistake from an abject failure?
we all know that we learn from our mistakes. We don't learn from our successes. I had the good fortune, we try at least. I had the good fortune of, like a lot of us, of being at the right place at the right time in Internet 1.0. And another friend of mine who since was tragically killed on 9/11 started a company in his dorm room at MIT, basically penniless, and it's now an S&P 500 company. It's called Akamai Technologies. They deliver a third of the content on the internet. Long story short, I was their first PR guy. I was fortunate to enjoy in some of that bounty. And I stopped. Like a lot of primitives, I didn't keep going. I stopped and I thought, where can I go roaming? What else can I do? Well, a shrink at the time said to me, don't be afraid of getting blown up. It's okay to step on some minefields. And I stepped on one and lost $2 million trying to do a web video startup before YouTube. I have never learned more in my professional career. And I think it gets back to rather than saying it's all good, which is a phrase that we've heard over and over again. Note that it was a phrase that we heard especially before COVID-19, that it's all good. We now know it's not all good. And I put myself out in the book in a way as one of the poster boys for the value of being a little insecure. We talked about that in the intro, but I like to say a little anxiety is underrated. If you keep it on the right flame, it can really motivate you to achieve in a different way. And we talked about Kirk earlier at AT&T. He's in the top 25 executives of the company that has hundreds of thousands of people. And he said, especially as a person of color, he feels the onus is on him to even work harder, to even be more persistent, to be more diligent, to be more talented, to drive even harder. And he said, I consider myself an imposter. That's how Kirk described himself. I said, welcome to the club. I feel like an imposter too. Now, a lot of successful people see themselves that way. If it's too much, it's a problem. If it's a little bit, I think it can be really high octane jet fuel. The opposite of the imposter syndrome is something we talk about in the book, which is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. If anyone doesn't know this, Google it right now, and you'll see a Wikipedia entry. And it's for people who are incompetent, who actually think they are competent. So ask yourself if you've met people like that.
I think we could probably fill the phone book with
Yeah.
You're making me think, my first conscious memory is of my father. To be equal, you have to be superior. And that's the phenomenon that Kirk describes. And,
Yeah.
you know, he sees it kind of as a bird. Was, oh, is that all it takes? You know, is that all it takes? Because the world standard is just a C, and it doesn't take that much more work to get to be an A. So to have an A, so I always felt superior, and that gave me a tremendous amount of confidence going about what I did. But we've touched on this subject of insecurity. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the positive effects of insecurity?
Well, I think it drives us to achieve. I think it keeps us humble. There are several examples in the book that we point to. I'll out myself and say that when I was in a lecture hall at UCLA with 400 or 500 kids, I was scared to raise my hand. I thought if the professor turned to me, my face would turn 50 shades of red, Harvard crimson even. So I think there was shame there. What we talk about in the book, and one of the examples that we point to is my friend at Google, YouTube, Ricky Drury, that rather than fighting that impulse, rather than denying it, rather than masking it with a bunch of bravado and overconfidence, let's actually hug it and embrace it. And a lot of people might say, well, is that really relevant to the business world? One of the best bosses I ever had ran BBDO's office in Israel. And I got together with him last year. I usually see him once a year when he comes to the States. And he said, you know, our business is 80% psychology. It's only 10% actual business, and it's only another 10% marketing, advertising, PR. So for me, part of writing this book was to combine business with self-help, with career, with a lot of memoir. I'm a business book junkie. And there are those that I've loved. You know, I love reading Ariana's books. I love reading Adam Grant's books. I could go on and on. But for the ones that I don't love, I find that they are either too anonymous and I'm not seeing any human face, or they're full of, pardon me saying this because he just passed away, but Jack Welch like war stories. And, you know, there's a place for that, but sometimes in certain books, they go too far. So what I tried to do was help, you know, share my own stuff, if you will. And there's a lot of stuff that was on the editing room floor that I didn't share, but I wanted to show that vulnerability and transparency are not just buzzwords. They make you better managers. They make you better leaders. They make you more approachable as human beings. And certainly we're seeing that the human side of business is more important now than ever during this global pandemic.
We've got probably about 10 more minutes left, you and I want to talk about the just you and I before I bring in the others. I want to talk about the future of work, particularly on a day when, 40 million people are out of work. And you have some statistics in the book. You cite a Deloitte study that found that 12.3% of American workers, only 12.3% of Americans have a passion for their professions. You say 40% of the jobs in the legal sector might be automated by 2030, which is tomorrow, really. And that 95% of accountants will likely disappear when AI takes over number crunching. What is the future of work? I mean, it sounds like it's going to be a battlefield or a jungle, and primitive in that context might be even more appropriate than before.
Well, we have the different currents happening at the same time that feel very much like a perfect storm. You mentioned the first one that we talk about in the book, which isn't a surprise. And I would argue that it occurs more with civilized people than primitives, that they see work as a drudgery, that it's a chore. It's a job. I'm not supposed to like it. Check in, check out. No wonder Gallup says that 67% of us are burnt out, right? Then you add kind of the Andrew Yang type methodology and explanation of machine learning, AI, and jobs that we thought were safe, like you pointed out, are not necessarily safe anymore. Then you combine COVID and 40 million unemployed. And what you get is a blank show, and I'm not going to say the word, but it's a collective existential crisis. There are two types of people, I think, that are dealing with this. One are those that are fortunate and can step back and say, what do I really want to do? Right? We saw this a little bit after 9/11 in terms of recalibrating our professional goals and getting back to things that we might have wanted to do, but we're taught we shouldn't do, we must not do, et cetera, et cetera. There's another type of people who are facing more actual challenges to their health and their sustenance. And they are people that have to do the hustle. They are people who have to cobble different gigs and jobs together. I think all in all, it's going to be a huge shift, but I would be contrarian on one point, which is just as we can all cook at home, and theoretically, we don't have to go to restaurants anymore. I think there was something in the New Yorker saying the end of restaurants. I disagree completely. There's a human need to congregate, to hug, to socialize. this kind of greeting with our elbows virtually is not the same as the physical embrace that you and I had at Robert's Restaurant overlooking Central Park West on March 11th or 12th.
12, I remember.
So just as there's that need, here's another thing that I'll throw out there, and I'd like people to disagree with me and be oppositional. We should practice what we're preaching here. That people will have a need to get back to the office. Just like there's bottled up consumer demand. Not saying that people are going to necessarily go in every day, but there's a spontaneity and extemporaneous banter and brainstorming and creative spark that happens when people get together. And so I think it might look different, but I don't see offices going away. I think they're going to be redefined, but people have just that instinctive need to get out of the cave, squint in the sun, and go someplace.
Anybody has questions? Now would be a time to begin populating them in the Q&A box. I see there's one here. But just before we go to audience's questions, Marco, what, if you could sum it up in one statement, what do you want readers to take away from your book?
I'd like this book to be a book that hits a chord that other business and career books do not, that helps people who are really at a critical intersection in their own lives and are looking to be understood, are looking to transition to a different area, are looking to leapfrog ahead. You know, I work in a field where I work according to 30-day escape clauses. At any time, a client can call me and say, I'm exercising my 30-day escape clause. Rather than being petrified by that, I really see it as an opportunity to embrace change. There was a wonderful book years ago by a writer who's, I think, in her 90s now or late 80s, Judith Vorse, called Necessary Losses. So I've learned to reframe, and rather than mourn a client leaving, I celebrate a client coming, and I really enjoy writing that tiger. So I think for those of you out there that haven't felt understood, who have been told that you're not the right cultural fit, that you're not a team player, that on, and Jackie, we can talk more about some of the reasons for this, and I think it gets back to some of what you said earlier is a big part of it, but it's also about people who bring diversity of thought, and people don't want to hear that. They want the groupthink. Well, we know what happens to companies that just engage in groupthink. We can name them like Enron, Swissair, et cetera. They can implode very, very quickly. So I think it's giving those people permission, but it's also helping. Kirk McDonald told me, Marco, you're writing this for the civilized person. So if you relate to homing, step back and say, how can I be a bit more messianic about my career? That I think about it when I get up in the morning with excitement, that I think about it when I put my head on the pillow. How can I be a little bit more oppositional with my colleagues and not just nod and pat everyone in the back and say, that's a great idea, Bob, or Susie couldn't be more correct, but rather say, here's a different way of looking at that I'd like to propose.
The questions are coming in, and I have a thought I want to get to before we get to the end, because one of your closing thoughts in the book resonated with something I learned as a college senior. But here, let's take a question from Jeffrey. Said, what is your advice to a 20-year-old college sophomore who doesn't know what he wants to do? And he doesn't like IT or computer programming. Steve Jobs was not a techie. What do you say to your 20-year-old self, if you will?
I love that question. 3 quick thoughts, Jeffrey. One is you gotta hunt rather than fish. And what I mean by that is rather than throwing out a line and seeing who bites in kind of a reactive way, you need to follow what comes easy to you, what is natural to you. if you're not a math person, if you didn't ace the SAT math section, think about what does come easy. You know, maybe for me, it was writing, it was speaking. I literally got into Columbia University, and don't try this for those at home, but I left the whole math section blank. I hadn't taken math since Beverly Hills High School, or I filled in B's, right? I still got into Columbia University. I don't know how, it would never happen today. So the point is, for the Jeffreys out there is, you know, hunt, don't fish, like really be proactive in going after something. The second thing that I'd say to you is, don't get too attached to your first moves. I don't know if you remember that line in the book, Jackie, but we quote a writer who wrote about the book, the game of Go, the Chinese board game of the white pebbles and the black pebbles and surrounding each other. And his name is Troy Anderson. I got to get in touch with this guy, and I actually will. But one of the things I want to thank him for is reminding us, especially early in our career, don't get too attached to your first moves. It's okay to try something and then pivot. My first job, as I mentioned, was at a nonprofit. It was in 1989. I was counting the days until the year was over and 1990 came around. But it taught me a lot, and sometimes it teaches you what you don't want to do.
New phrase yesterday called pronoia. It's the opposite and it means the universe is conspiring to help you out. I know I disappeared here, but pronoia, the opposite of paranoia, the universe is conspiring to help you.
Absolutely.
It's a frame of mind.
It's a frame of mind. We talked about mindset earlier. There's a lot of overlap in my book deliberately between different fields. We don't get into faith deeply, but if you read between the lines, it's certainly there. And, you know, it gets into, like, Susan Jeffers in the 1970s wrote a book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, a classic bestseller. Yes, it relates to embracing that insecurity, but I think it also relates to embracing the fear and still moving forward, right? And that's definitely what it's about. As I said, I'm a junkie for reading, and I never thought I could write my own book. Some people might review it and say, you shouldn't have written a book, you should stay with your day job. But I think part of it is what Michael Singer calls the surrender experiment, which I think is close to what you're talking about, that you do your best and the universe will take care of the rest. And I think even those that are very cerebral and rational and analytic, letting go a little bit and letting some things take care of themselves rather than forcing it, I'm starting to learn the value of in middle age. And I wish I would have learned it a lot earlier.
Asen has a quote. Describe the level of being content and satisfied among the leaders you've studied.
That's a great question.
A primitive person also be content and satisfied.
Right. Look, I would answer yes and no. When I look at primitives, I definitely see a restless spirit. We see impatience. We see hunger. They are like kids. And we talk about that in the book, like play like a 5-year-old rather than conference calls, have a play date, right? So I think that's a big part of it. The other part is really not just being the curious George, but being able to connect with like-minded people who want to define success, not just in terms of monetary success, but in terms of impact, in terms of independence, and in terms of fun. One of the reasons that I think primitives are happier at work is they meld play and work. For them, it's fun, it's childlike, right? It's adventure. So overall, I would say I found primitives to be more content, but I will not disagree with the fact that they have this restless spirit inside of them that keeps pushing them for more.
That was actually going to be my closing thought when I was a futurist said that we were never going to be able to afford to retire. So our work and our pleasure should be so that's what I've always tried to do, have your work and your pleasure.
Absolutely. You cut out a little bit, but I got most of it, Jackie.
Work and pleasure being fun.
Absolutely. And I told you when we first met how I used to watch you on CBS News and say, she's one of my heroes, and idolize you. And I worked at CBS as an intern, and then we got a chance to work together and become friends. And for me, getting into PR was natural because I worship journalists. I thought they were the most interesting people in the world. I wanted to interface with them and have coffee with them and pitch them on stories. So it's an example of a lot of that kid-like wonder we can tap into to allow ourselves to not just succeed, but to really thrive in what is a very challenging environment. And sometimes, we got to take one step back to go two steps forward. And one trend that I'd like to just underline for folks out there, especially those that are looking for work rather suddenly, is to downshift and perhaps consider taking on temporarily work that others would consider beneath them, right? That you're too good for that. But this is a time when the premium, I think, is definitely being a generalist rather than a domain expert. That domain might go away very quickly. So being adaptable, being flexible, being nimble, these are all part of that primitive brain that is quicker, that is more emotive, and yes, that is sometimes fight or flight.
We have a question from, we both know, Rebecca Morrison, who was your student at Fordham. I was in your class. And now she's a rising
star student.
Yeah, a rising star now at IBM. She says, how do you balance ego with humility and vulnerability?
Great question.
Is it static 70-30 or is it situational?
Right. First of all, they're not mutually exclusive. I think a lot of people, especially in the business community, and I can also pick on older white men who are CEOs of huge companies, I think need to get in touch more with that vulnerability, with that sensitivity, with that need to know everything rather than saying, I don't know. Remember, I don't know. And that's sometimes very disarming in a positive way. On the other hand, it's important to have a healthy ego. And I think there's a difference between a healthy ego and an unhealthy ego. Unhealthy egos, there are many examples out there. I won't point to them, but you all don't have to be mind readers to know where I'm going on that. And the definition of malignant narcissists down the line, these are people with unhealthy egos. But I think that yin yang, and that's a lot of what the book is talking about, right? That we can have two contradictory thoughts at the same time, that we can walk and chew gum, that it's not just right or left, etc., that it's often a blend. It's often we're in the spectrum. And I'd like to believe, Rebecca, that we can have a healthy ego. And at the same time, part of having that healthy ego is being able to admit our vulnerabilities, talk about our insecurities, and let people inside our head, our heart, and our soul, while also maintaining boundaries. And that's another important thing. There are people who are uber primitives who have gone off the rails. We could name names like Elizabeth Holmes. We could name names like Adam Newman of WeWork. Full disclosure, WeWork is a former client, and they did amazing things. But that primitive often needs to surround herself or himself with a civilizing force to keep them on the rails. And you see a lot of examples that we point to in the book precisely on that point.
Great from Toby. What habits can we practice to become better roamers?
Is that Toby Kovacs?
Yes.
Great. Toby, great. Toby, we met through a mutual friend at the time at CNN, Adam Levine, who is now gone to the top of the organization. Toby, you should link in with him if you haven't already. Self-awareness is a big part of it, obviously, right? So if we tend to be civilized, and I don't want to analyze you, Toby, but I know you and I love you and I respect you, and you are the kind of civilizing force that a primitive like me needs to scale an organization. We're both on the spectrum. I skew a little more primitive, you skew a little more civilized. I think it's stepping back and saying, you know, of that acronym, what am I deficient on? It's kind of looking at, do I need more vitamin A? Do I need more vitamin C? Do I need more vitamin D? And picking out those areas, right? So for some of us, we talked about oppositional, but for others, it could be more gallant. That's what they need to feed their soul. Jackie Adams, you saw me at a point when I was in a cubicle at Burson Marsteller as an MD, and I was actually depressed. And you looked at me and said, you got to get out of here. This place is crushing your soul. And it was a wonderful learning experience, but it was really tough. But Toby, the gallant thing, look at that bucket, my friend. You're doing that naturally, but there are examples in the book that we talk about that people get outside themselves and start putting the other in front. There's one illustration that really speaks to me. My wife and I, with our two oldest kids, went to Tanzania. We met one of the most inspiring people I've met who's in the book. Her name is India Howell. She had a successful business. She was an investor in the Northeast. She went to climb Mount Kilimanjaro and never came back. Her dream was always to establish an orphanage. And that's what she's doing in Tanzania today. She was profiled on 60 Minutes. So there are so many examples where people can make those primitive moves. And even if they identify themselves as really, really civilized, think about how you can give yourself permission to tap into some of that fuel injection to take your life and your career to the next level.
Toby actually has another question. Is gallant primitive or learned, and is it really essential? And he talks about people who walk over people to get to the top.
I have seen some of the most ruthless behavior actually from some of the most civilized among us, who on the surface are non-confrontational, but we've all been there and we've all been stabbed in the back. I think a primitive stabs you in the front, that they're open and honest with what they're feeling and what they're doing. One of the books that I quote in my book is The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich Harris. And she has a line, she passed away recently, I discovered her in a New York Times obit. And the book is somewhat controversial, she's definitely a primitive. But what she says is, even though the jungle might be bloody, it is not devoid of love and loyalty. I often find primitives who come from the heart do a little less analysis paralysis, a little less this side of the ledger, that side of the ledger, and really do the right thing for their people. One quick example that occurred in the book that we talk about, Austin McCord, who started Datto, the only unicorn in Connecticut, he was given an offer for $100 million to sell his company when he was still in his 20s. He had started this company on $80,000 of credit card debt. His attorney said, "You're crazy not to take this offer. You can buy an island in the South Pacific and spend the rest of your life regretting this decision." Well, what did Austin do? He said, you know what? I'm turning down the $100 million. Why? Because my employees aren't really going to partake according to the terms of the deal. They're not going to benefit. He continued to build the company for several more years. I happened to work with him for a couple, as I mentioned, at the end. And then we told the story with Robert F. Smith. So it was not 100 million, it was north of 1.5 billion, right? So that's an example of doing the right thing pays dividends. And I don't believe that nice guys finish last. I got a text message from the nicest guy in Hollywood, Ron Meyer, who's featured in my book, who did the right thing in paying for my dad's memorial when my dad died at 55 and died broke. And Ron was one of the heads of CAA and my sister was working for him. He never met my dad. I had never met him. The instinct was, I'm paying for the memorial. It was just, give me the check. It's like Michael Jordan, give me the ball, right? So I think just as we're reclaiming the word primitive, I think we need to reclaim those aspects of our nature that might not be the product of an Ivy League education, but come to us naturally and organically.
The first question, oops, sorry, I'm breaking up here again. The first question was from a 20-year-old looking for advice. Now we have a mid-career lawyer at a big firm. With the changes coming in the workplace with AI and so on, what should he do? What should anybody do in an industry that's likely to be disrupted by AI?
Well, it sounds like he's already doing something right in asking the question. And I think he's also tapping in to some of the primitive and primal instincts that we're talking about. And I would put a little healthy paranoia as part of that letter I in the roaming, and having that sixth sense that something might not be going right, right? Animals have that sense. My dog Winston, before a thunderstorm, he knows it's going to be thundering way before we do. Trust that instinct. Listen to your body, listen to your mind on that, and then develop a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, and start working in that area sooner rather than later. So it doesn't mean that you have to quit your day job, but if it is teaching law, if it is providing legal counsel to a nonprofit, if it is being a mentor for kids that need it, if it is going to in-house to one of your clients, if it is going to a smaller boutique, if it is putting up your own shingle, look at all those different options, leverage it. It would be, I said a Hebrew word, I'm going to say one Yiddish word that we all know. It's pronounced chutzpah. It would be chutzpah of me to have that answer. But I think A, you're asking the really right question, and B, really just throw out those options. Throw out those options on a piece of paper, prioritize them, and realize that at the end of the day, and Rebecca, you remember this, when Love Welchel came to speak at our class at Fordham University. Love is a former colleague of Jackie's and mine, and he said, look, forget about trying to game the job boards. The algorithms don't hire people, people hire people. And I was on the phone with him yesterday and he said, look, it's a lot like any relationship or even dating, establishing the trust, showing you're interested, showing you're interested in, taking it slowly, et cetera, but you got to start somewhere and you got to start with the people. And it sounds corny, but it's true.
I'm going to go over a minute here with this final question. Is it ever too late to become a primitive? And are they born or made?
It's never too late. It's never too late to make more of a primitive move. I see it all around me. I see it with my best friend, the love of my life, my wife, Stacy, who only a few weeks ago made a primitive move to get a job as a certified alcohol and substance abuse counselor in Pittsfield, Mass. She did it not just by applying on Indeed, but targeting the right individual at the rehab, infiltrating the organization, going not to HR, but going directly to the woman who runs it and explaining what she can offer. So that was not the instinctive thing that came naturally to her, but based on us going back and forth. I'd like to think, Stacey, a little bit based on the book. You said, you know, it's time for me to not wait in that line anymore. It's time for me to leapfrog the line. So it's never too late. I continue to urge people to make those primitive moves, whether it's learned or taught. I don't want this to be a cop-out, but I think it's a little of both. I think there are people who, with their temperament, are born to be more primitive. My son is an example of that. He's already in the uber primitive side, while I'm really in the middle of the spectrum there. But I think the good news is, and what we want to do with this book is, again, make it accessible to everyone. And nothing makes me feel better when especially women come back to me and say, you know what? I need to give myself permission to go and ski out of bounds and not just on the circumscribed track in my career, but
before
to do
menopause.
what I'm not supposed to. What?
Before menopause.
So you can learn it. Some of it's born with. It helps if you're raised by primitives. I was raised by primitives, and then I thought going to New York would get me all civilized, and I went to Bloomingdale's to get a suit. My girlfriend bought me a black briefcase, and I wasn't quite man with a gray flannel suit, but I realized, in part in working with Jackie and her telling me, get out of this cubicle, that I returned to my more primitive roots. And part of the purpose of this book is to give others the opportunity to have a similar experience.
Marco, I don't know where the hour went. Thank you so much. And everyone, the book is primitive. You can get it on Amazon.com.
And a shout out to Hachette for giving an opportunity for this middle-aged first-time author. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.